Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much as well. I'll move to the next presenter and panelist, Avinash Chanchal, who is the campaign director for BBC South Asia. And Avinash is also a former journalist and published author. He's been a campaigner with the organization for 10 years, extensively working on issues of air pollution, fossil fuel emissions, climate justice, climate adaptation, and urban aspiration. Avinash is known as the powerful force behind misinformation narratives. When faced by highly polarized narratives, he consistently questions them and challenges them. So our next panelist is Pankaj Chanchal, and that is by way of art historian, dancer, filmmaker, and author, whose works bridges the worlds of ancient art and popular culture. He's a master of art and he has renowned university credentials from S&P Global, Indiana University, Science Format College as well, specializing in the study of ancient Indian motifs. An accomplished writer, Kanika has authored Lupadhake, which is Unknown Sculptors of Ancient India, 2019, along with numerous research papers on Indian sculpture, aesthetics, painting, and mythology. Her latest works, The Cursed Land of Lustful Women and the Power of Storytelling, 2023, continue her exploration of history, art, and cultural narratives. Kanika was also the only Indian selected for the Slovene Ethnographic Museum's Artist in Residence for the Taking Care Project, an initiative focused on reinterpreting ethnographic collections through contemporary perspectives. Welcome, Kanika. And the last panelist I would like to introduce is, of course, Pankaj Seksaria, who is a researcher, writer, photographer, campaigner, and academic. He has worked extensively in the field of environment and wildlife conservation with a particular focus on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. His debut novel, The Last Wave, which I've had the opportunity to teach in an environmental humanities class here, was also based on the Andamans and it's on the situation after the tsunami. So, welcome, Pankaj, and welcome to all of you. I would like to begin the conversation by thinking a little bit about the title of this panel, which is just a moment, if I may just bring this up, which is the climate crisis and the cost of silence. And I wanted to ask what the cost of silence meant for all of you. And feel free to jump in when, and I'm not going to go in order per se of the presentations, but feel free to pitch in. So the cost of silence, what exactly does it mean? To think a little bit about the cost of silence, especially in this moment when, the question of the climate crisis and policies, especially in the United States, where I'm based, has it's been so hostile. So so thinking globally, so to speak, in some sense, of the cost of silence, and also maybe what it means for you personally at a personal level and also at a professional and disciplinary level. So maybe I'd like to open up with this question, and so feel free to jump in, whoever wants to take the lead. Thank you.
I can jump in on this
Sure.
one.
Hmm.
So, the question that I would pose right back to you, Amit, and the rest of the panelists is, how are we defining the cost of silence? Are we talking about climate denial? Are we talking about inaction? If we're talking about climate denial, yes, from a US perspective, which is my area of expertise, yes, there is slight acknowledgement under the Trump administration that it's happening, but it has to be seen in a larger context. Okay, there are lots of technologies that are being promoted by this administration. To be fair, that are zero emitting, like geothermal, like hydropower, like nuclear, etc. So that's one element. Inaction is obviously any progress that was made on addressing the climate through regulation, through policies, through tax credits, it's going to slow down. There's no question about it. Under the Trump administration, they have made it clear they're getting rid of rules, they're getting rid of staff, they're getting, uh, and right now the reconciliation process is going on in the U.S. Congress, and so there's that element of it. Looking at it globally, we are talking losses. We're already feeling the climate effects, and those are going into the trillions. Now, from a US perspective alone, just to put this in, provide you with context, NOAA puts out these numbers. Last year, there were climate fueled events that there were 27 of them, which cost 184.8 billion with a B. Okay. So, and in the last, I don't know, 20 years, the cost has gone up to 2.945 trillion with a T. So, this is the scale that we're looking at. It's happening everywhere. It's no longer something in the future, it's happening now. So,
Thank you so much. Of course, the question of, on the one hand, climate denialism is an issue. And you're correct to point out the question of slowing down under the Trump administration. But there's also the issue of, let's say, uh, just the cumulative effect of climate change and the fact of how, for instance, both we at individual community levels as well as at policy levels can kind of think a little bit about this global dimension of climate change itself. So I would invite the other participants maybe to respond to the specific questions put out by Amina, and then we can kind of extend this further in the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. So, if I may come here, I just want to say that in terms of personal experiences, and I come from India, this is where I'm born and brought up. I think there is a huge lack of awareness and conversations around this at a government level and also within the people. And since we all know that governments are largely people driven, no matter how much we criticize them, ultimately we are their vote banks. If we do not raise this as an important point, the government will never take it up, at least in India. So, for example, even in Delhi, there was this state election very recently. The entire conversation was around building of roads, how bad the roads is, how many more bridges we need, how many more flyovers we need. Nobody wanted to speak about pollution, for example, or even if some people did speak about pollution, it was just a matter of propaganda because nothing has ever changed per se. And in terms of effect, I think we all feel the effect, especially we in India. We, especially the city people, let's say Delhi especially, for example, we know how bad Delhi is. It's in the news all the time. Each one of us feels it. We ignore it constantly, and somewhere deep inside we know there is nobody at this moment in Delhi who's not sick or unwell, having some or the other breathing issues, some or the other respiratory issues, or stomach or gut issues. But then we never ever address that it may be due to a larger climate change that is more than evident to all of us. And it's not simply in terms of air pollution or bad water, or for that matter the hybrid seed food that we eat. So hybrid seed is a huge issue in India as well. There are farmer suicides. So everything is linked. First of all, we cannot segregate farmer suicides as a separate concern and climate change as a separate concern. It's all linked. So we are constantly failing to address it as people, as a society. And there is a huge lack of conversations around this. And that is suicidal, because the effects of it for us in India are very evident. In the past 100 years, in particular, if I look at the reduction in forest coverage area in India, it is unbelievable. I think it'll be the maximum in the world, and we don't take note of it. And we feel it does not matter. I think it is catastrophic.
Thank you, Kanika. And of course, one of the things that you mentioned here, which we can push a little bit further later on, is how the effect of climate change is actually being felt in our bodies, right? The fact about illnesses, whether it's in breathing, whether it's in the gut, and so on. So there is, of course, that element there. But Avinash and Pankaj, if you would like to join in.
Yeah, I would like to add what Kanika has said. Like, I feel like being as an Indian and as a community, the cost of this silence is about having 314 days of extreme weather events out of 365 days in a year. Like it means that 214 days of flood and landslides, 66 days of heat wave, 185 days of lightning, 46 days of cold wave, more than 3,000 deaths because of extreme weather events, thousands of house got damaged, massive destruction of our natural habitat, biodiversity, from a forest of Hasdeo in Chhattisgarh to Andaman, Nicobar to Western Ghat, everywhere. So I feel like that's like we are already in our life, in our daily life, we are facing this impact of climate inaction, and obviously, yes, we all are having this impact, witnessing these impacts. But we should not forget that there are the communities who are at the forefront of this climate impacts. They are facing more burnt of this climate crisis. Whether you are like they are working as an informal worker, where they are working as a street vendors. Imagine right now we are seeing unprecedented heat wave episodes in our cities, and how this is impacting our street vendors, our construction workers, our waste pickers. It's unimaginable. We can't even imagine the way it is impacting to their livelihood, to their health, to their and in general, we are not even like, we are just talking about the economic side of these damage, right? We are not talking about the non-economic loss and damage. So obviously, like it's massive, and this silence is causing these crises. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, good evening. I have a slightly different take on this. While I agree with what all three have said, and I was just thinking as I was listening also, if of something of the paradox of the climate change and silence. So, while I agree with Kanika, but I do think that there is a lot of conversation around climate change. I mean, we certainly need more, but actually, I think it is too much of a particular kind of conversation around climate change. And I say that from two or three kind of contexts from what I see. If one looks at the media, for instance, there's an incredible amount of reporting, at least in the Indian media, on environmental issues, on forests, on wildlife, much more than earlier. And I think it's far underestimated than actually there is, because we track the media on a regular basis. I do multiple newsletters on that. So there is a lot of information constantly, sometimes out of context, actually. And I'll come to that. The other is in educational institutions, if you look at the kind of programs that are being put together, multiple universities, multiple institutions now have programs, departments on climate studies and climate science. There are more and more programs at the master's level, PhD levels. I've been in conversation with many young groups trying to argue and see, what are the possibilities in terms of, say, careers going forward. So they're seeing the need and trying to see how they can work with that. So there is a huge amount of conversation, in my opinion. The problem is twofold. I think one is it is very very transactional, if I put it that way. So everything is put in the basket of climate change. Now, the problem with that is it is completely undermining and ignoring the more structural, the more political, the more equity-based things, because a extreme weather event, of course, there is a complication and there's a dimension of that related very much to what's happening to the weather and to climate. But the impacts of that are not necessarily without looking at the political and the environmental and the social and the equitable issue. So what happens to land? Who owns land? Who is allowed to make a house there? Who gets pushed to the margins? So I think it becomes, counterproductive when everything is then put in the basket of climate change alone. And I think conversations starting with climate change, my response has been, let's start somewhere else. It is very important. It needs to be done. But we can't start by making the climate change discussion, because uh, and I see this in some of my colleagues, there's a concern over fear mongering. So if you look at the narratives on climate change, we are just saying too much more. And if you look at the data over the last 30, 40 years, what was said, I mean, actually, I'm in the middle of a conversation with colleagues here in IIT Bombay who are saying that, yes, we are concerned, but what is the data that was offered? What is actually happening? So that is something that we might actually undercut some of the issues and some of the possibilities. And the third, final quick point, and agreeing completely, is that there's a huge disconnect between what we are seeing and saying and what we are doing. So we might talk of doing these climate action plans, while at the same time we want to do nothing about the tree cover being lost in the neighborhood. And like Avinash mentioned, in large numbers across the country, we are not aware to the values that biodiversity, that tree cover brings to us. So outside the window, we forget what's happening. Inside, you are sitting and making climate action plans. So I mean, there are multiple paradoxes there that actually how I would look at it as my starting set of comments here.
Could
Would
I
any
jump
of
in?
the panelists like to respond to Pankaj's provocation as well? I think these are very interesting conversations to be had about paradoxes when we deal with climate change, so to speak. Yeah.
So, if I may
If
say
I'm
something here, because there is this whole idea of a conversation happening in India, I think it is from a very, I don't want to use the word, but I think I should now, capitalistic and materialistic perspective. It is not talking about the human side of it, the reality side of it, and we all expect some technology to come and solve it. We forget that the biggest technology is a forest, and everything need not be controlled by humans. We are such control freaks, we think we want to control everything. It does not function like that. We want to create city forest. I think that is an absolutely false idea. Natural forests need to exist, and I don't know what is the problem with that. Why can't we let a natural forest exist which we do not control? Because it's so perhaps problematic to the human mind that there is something that we are not controlling and we have to be in control of everything that happens. I think it is a problematic idea to have everything under human control, and the approach therefore is human centric, not landscape centric or nature centric. And then coming from a very let's say lower middle class community and a colony here in Delhi, I can tell you that there is very little conversation about, let's say, climate change. Yes, it's just a word floating around in the air. Nobody even understand what it means, how it's affecting. Nobody cares, and there is definitely very, very little conversation around it, if at all. So all the conversation that is happening within a certain, let's say, colonial perspective, materialistic perspective, is within certain very specific setups, let's say educational setups, because that will lead to, let's say, more money for some people. That will also become a setup within the capitalist materialistic larger setup, and therefore it will never solve the problem. But the conversation is not coming or reaching the people it should, the larger section of the people who are actually affected, people who do not have huge amounts of money. It has to come from them also, and it's not coming from them. That is what I mean about conversation coming from people, not from somebody sitting, let's say, in very high societies or some university spaces alone. That I don't think that will be enough ever, because the politicians then will never take hold of note of it. We as people are not taking note of it, and we're not going to solve the problem or reach anywhere.
So I wanted to jump in and address something that Amit had brought up and something that Pankaj brought up and Dr. Kanika brought up and Avinash brought up. I hope I didn't mispronounce anybody's names. Um, I think as a journalist, I have always, as an environmental journalist, actually, I have always looked for solutions. Okay, how do you turn this issue, because it becomes too abstract for the average person to understand. So the way I have seen it being played out, and not only in the United States, in certain communities where I've gone and reported, but also right now I'm in Pakistan and I'm seeing it play out as a pocketbook issue. High electricity bills. Well, what is the cheapest option available? It's solar, right? solar is zero emitting. Solar does not bring in pollution. And it's lowering people's bills. It's leading to a slightly better quality of life in the sense that they are not being impoverished by extremely high electricity bills. I have seen the same thing, same pattern, in fact, work out in a school in Pennsylvania where I reported in the run up to the election last year. And there's a small town called Steelton, Pennsylvania, which is the home of the first US steel plant. And over there, the school with I think 90% of the children in that school were coming from, live below the poverty line. And the school administrators wanted to, they wanted to get more resources for the school, but all their money was going into electricity bills. So what they did was they entered a contract, and there's a huge solar array field. There was a covered landfill. They put the solar array, and they were able to lower the electricity costs. They applied for a diesel, I think it was an electric school bus initiative. So they've got electric school buses running. They've cut down their fuel costs, etc. Here in Pakistan, I was out in Baltistan, and I saw schools, a solar panel. I think a pair of solar panels were being installed so that the children could have, fans and electricity during the day so they could study. I went to a small urban school in a very low income community in Karachi, and I saw that they are using solar panels to power the laptop so they can teach them how to write, you know, for little kindergarten children. So the idea has to be that if you want to promote this conversation about climate change, you have to look at climate solutions, and you have to present those in terms of how they affect people's pocketbooks.
Avinash, would you like to respond?
I feel like I like kind of agree about the fact that there is enough noise in a certain pockets, certain academia, certain intellectual debates, those intellectual spaces. There is enough noise about it. Also, if you see the policy documents which our government has been preparing from last many years, from at least from Paris Agreement, all these documents we have in place. Like in India, we launched our National Action Plan on Climate Change in 2008. But at the same time, we have been seeing and those, if you go through those documents, it's well written, well researched documents, right? But it is just becoming a guiding document, and it's not like there's no implementation of those like whatever recommendations are there in those documents. It remains recommendation, and not the implementation is happening about on those. So I feel like that's the real gap. That in one pocket we are seeing a lot of discussions, research, policy papers, but at the same time we don't have any stories about how communities are facing these crises, how communities are fighting against these crises. Like there are also a lot of stories are there when we talk to the worker groups, when we talk to the frontline communities. They come up with a lot of stories, which I feel like is a story of a resilience, is a story of a solidarity, which no one talks about. So yes, there is a noise about climate change, but at the same time, we are missing somewhere that that story about climate change, and it all like becomes like a very jargon or number heavy, data centric like noise, and not the story driven, the human like experience driven discussion and discourse. Yeah.
Listening to your all your comments, it makes me think about a couple of things which I'd like to extend a bit further. One, of course, is the naming of the issue itself as climate change, right? I mean, it's kind of seems so big and abstract that sometimes it seems overwhelming, especially when we think about it at more global dimensions, right? And I'm also thinking about Pankaj's comment that maybe sometimes there could be a displacement into other registers, social, ecological, political in some ways, which could allow us a certain way, maybe of contending with these issues at much localized and smaller levels. I'm thinking, so to speak, about Kanika's comment, right? When you speak, for instance, to people in your locality, are there other languages through which climate change, for instance, is being conceptualized? I'm go back to Amina's comment as well, which, I mean, when you talk about, for instance, the use of solar power, and certain local ways through which, the question of, let's say, climate change, or even the question of environmental degradation is being talked about. And finally, to Avinash's point about stories, which of course is something that really interests me as well. Like, what are the stories that are being told? What are the more, located stories that are being told through which a larger abstract problem, like, let's say, climate change, is actually being contended with, is actually being conceptualized? Maybe there's a gap between what we can call the kind of policy, the abstract theoretical discussions, as opposed to the languages that are forming from spaces. I wouldn't say spaces necessarily from below, but languages that are forming, so to speak, in different locations about climate change. So maybe it might be just an invitation to talk about that in some sense, as opposed to, let's say, a larger abstract concept like climate change itself. So I would invite your responses to that. Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe I can pitch in here. I think the climate change, like I personally, I believe, and that's all like my personal belief, that we should stop talking about climate change. Climate change is a housing crisis. Climate change is a livelihood crisis. Climate change is a public health crisis, and we have to deal in that manner, right? Like, for example, we work with street vendors for heat wave campaign. We never talk about heat wave or climate change with them. We are talking about how they have a right in the city, how they have a right to get equal public space, how they have a right to do the bending in the place where they are doing it, and how heat in the context of heat, and when they face eviction drives from the state, is making the things worse for them, right? So we are not talking to them about climate change. We are talking to them about their livelihood, about their public health, about their housing crisis, and so on. And that really moving, like we can definitely see how when we talk about the issue which people think are personal, right? We need to make the whole discourse personal. We need to talk about their economic struggle, their other social struggle, and then they will come along with us to fight climate change. The problem is all these climate groups, all these climate advocates, when we talk about climate change, we only talk about the climate change as a something in a very silo manner. So I think we need to break that. Yeah.
Yeah, if I
I
may say
totally
here.
agree.
Yeah, please, sorry, go ahead.
Uh, no, I was going to say I totally agree with Avinash. Like, as I mentioned, you have to talk about it in terms of pocketbook issues, or you talk about it in terms of jobs, bringing in trained union workers. You can talk about economic opportunities for training people in certain skills in certain areas that the clean manufacturing, clean tech economy is creating. Bring more people into the conversation. But unfortunately, the issue of climate policies, climate politics has become very bifurcated and has become politicized, especially in the US. But as we have seen in the last 4 years, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which poured billions into the economy to jumpstart this clean tech economy, we have seen the people who didn't vote for the Inflation Reduction Act, meaning the Republicans, actually their communities have benefited the most. So there are a lot of stories to be told. The story can be told of a young apprentice worker, of of a school that has suddenly being able to teach its children about water scarcity. Water scarcity is something that sort of gets underplayed, and it affects South Asia most. In Pakistan, in India, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, and all of these places, water is affecting, and climate is affecting the supply of water, how water flows in, what kind of water treatment is available, where salinity issues are happening, where flooding is taking place, where we're running out of water. There are multiple stories that you can tell, and you can add in the fact that this is being fueled. That's just one line in your story or in your narrative when you're talking about it. I mean, there's so many stories that have been written, novels have been written, and around. And I I think it's already happening personally, but I think it can be done more. And I've seen the trend going towards more and more coverage. Of course, some people are jumping on the bandwagon and taking advantage of it and trying to fit other issues into it. But for the most part, this is how I see it.
Yeah, so if I may come in here, I just want to say that I still feel that there is a huge amount of lack of awareness, which I personally witness when I work extensively. So, for example, in Odisha, I have been working since 3 to 4 years, and I've been working with farmers, working in the sense I've been interviewing and documenting cotton farming, and it is being encouraged to use genetically modified seed despite knowing the fact that Odisha is still a more or less virgin land for cotton farming. So, if we look at Maharashtra, farmer suicides have been extensive. And why? Because it is this cycle of GM seed. You keep adding more fertilizer, then more chemical, and then ultimately the farmer is going to get into more and more loans. He is not going to be able to repay. The profit will not be enough, and he will drink the pesticide. So, this cycle is coming into Odisha. Nobody has any awareness. The government is not discouraging genetically modified seeds. There are very few groups working on organic cotton. Of course, they don't not exist, but it is just, it's not making a change. So there is a huge problem in Uttar Pradesh, in Punjab. Once Punjab, Haryana, not 50, 100 years ago, was extensively forested. Over the past 100 years, we've completely ruined it. And still, people don't care. Still, there is no conversation about reforestation of certain patches which are absolutely imperative. So, for example, Indian mountains, Himalayas, if you look at the condition in which these hills are, these mountains are, it's devastating. And recently, we have made a 4-lane road on a mountain. What is the mountain going to do? We've made a tunnel in the longest tunnel, and we are proud of it. The tunnel has collapsed. That never comes into the news. People die. What is the mountain going to do? So when I go to these mountains before the rains. They cut the trees, they dig the hill, and they leave it, and the rain comes and the soil just washes away. Where is the awareness in the people or in the government? Nobody speaks for it. I see the water turning red and brown because the soil is being drained down. Then there is a landslide, people die, there are accidents. Nobody cares. Holiday still continues. Tourism is on a high. We are still promoting tourism everywhere in India. Tourism is what we want because we want capital. I really don't see these conversations happening. And then certain technologies, I think I would say that it is extremely problematic to consider certain technologies as solutions. So, for example, battery run cars are not the solution. Batteries are going to leave you with certain residue, and where are they going to land up? Almost like nuclear waste or past computer waste, it's going to be a colonial project. It's going to be dumped into islands of indigenous communities, and some of these communities which are in extreme minority have awareness, in fact. So I'm recently working with Ho community and Kuduk community. So Orang community, actually they speak a language called Kuduk, and I'm working and I'm talking to them, and I'm hoping to shoot something with them. They have awareness, but they can't do anything. They're not able to bring a change because the larger section of the society does not care, does not listen, or they basically don't bother. So I think, yes, certain indigenous communities, Adivasi communities, they have certain kinds of awareness, especially in Jharkhand where I work, or Odisha for that matter. I'm working in eastern part of India since the recent years. But otherwise, what I see is a very, very sorry state of affairs. We are still doing construction even in the Sikkim hills. These are extremely sensitive belt. We want to still make some helipads and some bridges and trains. Why do we want to make all this? So there is this over touristic concerns that we have, and also heritage suffers. So we have absolutely ignored this whole idea of our cultural heritage, and that how hugely that gets affected by these over materialistic capitalistic projects. And of course that harbingers our health, our well-being of everybody, rich, poor, or everybody. And of course it brings a catastrophe, the catastrophe of climate change. Yeah.
Amit, I was just wondering if I could ask you to reflect as you uh, teaching climate fiction and engaging with the story and text and students, both from where you're located, but also say the context of South Asia where we are. What is your sense of stories around climate change? And there's a whole new genre of climate fiction, or whether it's new or it existed or it has a new name. So, would you like to share with us? Because it'll be very fascinating to get your insights into this as well.
Actually, I was trying to move to that question in a
Oh,
bit, but
okay.
thank you for asking it. But just kind of like a brief response. Since I teach climate fiction here, and I'd like to connect it also to a couple of comments that have already been made by some of our panelists, right? For instance, Avinash talked about silos, right? The fact that silos are the one that kind of inhibit conversation. Kanika talked about, for instance, connectedness, that in a way we have to think about connectedness, not just in terms of connectedness in terms of the human and the non-humans around, but also disciplinary connectedness, right? So if you want, for instance, to talk about climate change, and I would like to use this as a way to move transition probably to the next phase as well, is the way in which a certain connectedness comes, because when we tell the story of climate, right, and when we tell the story of humans and non-humans in the climate, so to speak, in some ways, we are talking about, for number one, long time frames. Right. We are talking about time frames of planetary history. We are talking, in some sense, also about time frames of the present. We are also speculating about the future, right? So, in a way, one could obviously say that here too, it's not just a kind of disciplinary connection, so to speak, in some sense, but it's also a kind of temporal connection, one that you cannot think linearly, although we do think linearly. I mean, and I agree with Kanika that in many ways, capitalistic thinking in forces us to think linearly, so to speak. But there are other ways of thinking about the interconnections of different time frames. For instance, when you talk about indigenous groups and so on, that definitely bring a much more complicated story into the picture. And I think part of the question of climate change and climate change fiction comes precisely from that, in terms of not simply telling stories of the ticking time bomb scenario. But I mean, look at, I mean, the classic kind of genre which is prevalent here in the United States is that of a dystopia, which is, as Jennifer Wenzel once said, the third world coming to the first world. The idea of, like, the first world becoming the third world. And I think a lot of my students are kind of immersed within that kind of framework. So part of it is also to think about how they are being affected here and now. Making those connections, I think, is the essential bit. That it's not simply a problem there, it's also a problem here, but here and there kind of keep merging together. Think, for instance, even about the typhoons and the storms that happened in the US in October. I mean, in Florida, for instance, and the fact that the superstorms are growing, so to speak, in magnitude. But that's a way of teaching it. I would like to repose this question though. Let me begin first of all by asking a question about representation. Pankaj has written a novel, right? The Last Wave. Brilliant novel, which I would highly recommend everyone to read, about Andamans. And of course, your work is so much about the Andamans. Kanika works in art history, which obviously makes us think disciplinary, in a disciplinary sense, in longer time frames, right? I mean, your work also is about ancient. I mean, your first book was about ancient India, and in some ways, you're thinking about longer durations of time. I mean, I'm fascinated by how your scientific background, for instance, influences your journalistic writing. And Avinash, if you can talk a little bit about your book as well and how you brought these different dimensions together. Maybe this could enable us not simply to talk about the cost of silence, but the possibilities of speaking. So let's think about that maybe in the second section. So anyone who would like to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I can begin. So I mean, when I speak about art history, yes, it is a lot of reflecting into the past. And somewhere I think my motivation was from what I was seeing around me. Talking about the Himalayas, let's say, I'm born and brought up in Delhi. I would always go up to the hills. And it is not long durational in India, very sadly. I have seen the change in the past 10 years very, very strongly. In the past 20 years, it is huge from what I witnessed. And of course, so I'm from, I'm an 80s child, as they say. I mean, we were taught climate change in our books, but well, there was a forest next to our school that was cut down. So this textual information is very, it's fake. It's very, to cover the syllabus. And you know how education works, that's another conversation altogether. But so coming back to my work, I have studied ancient Indian cults, and within that, I was interested in forest deities. So, how forests were perceived in ancient India. And for the longest time, there have been communities that have lived in peace and not against environment. So, what we see of history is as if we just have 5,000 years of history and then suddenly humans were, I don't know, not even Homo sapiens. It's not true. We've had much longer historical period where humans were living and they've not left trace, and now we're finding little traces across the world from archaeology that communities have existed, and these were forest gathering people. These were not agriculture based communities, and they were not some poor poverty stricken people. They were very advanced communities. So how we perceive indigenous communities, particularly in India, is still very, very problematic. We see a certain kind of people who live within a certain, let's say, forests or spaces as below or as poverty stricken. That is the larger image, which is a very problematic image to begin with. And yes, even in history, I have been able to trace patterns of deforestation that have negatively affected, and people have reacted in different ways to it. So yes, it has been a journey, but what we have seen in the past 100 years in India is absolutely unprecedented. So for example, even the stories of Soni Mahiwal, which come from Punjab, or the Heer Ranjha that have been re-recited within that region, they talk about forests. They talk about these forested rivers and beautiful trees, and these lovers are going there for the rendezvous. They don't exist. They don't exist anymore. So these forests are not part of imagination. They existed, and they don't exist today. And if we pick up any book, they'll just say, oh, there is no information about what forest existed 100 years ago. In fact, we just have to look at different sources. So I think art history that has, I mean, again, it's not as if one discipline will talk about forest, one discipline will talk about this. We have information, and it's right there for us to tap into. So art history is a great source to study, to look at all of this. I think, yeah.
That's a fascinating response. And just to kind of just continue my response also to Pankaj's question I was out thinking about. I mean, one way of thinking about climate fiction is to think of it as very presentist, that it's just written in the last 20 or 30 years. But I think what Kanika's response tells us is how we can reread the past. Let's say the Soni Mahiwal story in terms of the question of the presence and absence of forests. That in many ways, the perspectival point of, let's say, climate change makes us reread older texts in different ways as well. So maybe that's one way of kind of addressing your question. But any other responses anyone wants to join in terms of your own kind of, you know, own endeavors, both professionally, artistically, as well as in a disciplinary fashion?
You like me to jump?
Yeah, go ahead, Amina, go ahead. We were all waiting.
Maybe,
Yeah.
no. I was gonna say that from a personal perspective, just answering your question about the link between chemistry and journalism. I was, as a child growing up in Pakistan, I was always, interested in, picking up papers. And we, in our school, we had this, time after, when classes ended, or when break ended, we would be given the opportunity to go and, pick up the litter. Of course, I jumped at it because it's a way to avoid going back to class. But, in the larger sense, some of the good stuff filtered in. And, I became obsessed with this idea. And so I think that, some of those things filtered in. Then I was studying all about chemistry, where you are seeing different things react. And what we forget, and I keep coming back to the same thing, I'm sort of going on a slightly different tangent to the rest of the panelists. But some of the solutions are involving chemistry. So I'm able to see what I studied in action. But from a larger perspective, I would say that, in all of the sciences, you test, you verify, you question, and then you confirm. As a journalist, you're not testing, but you're asking a variety of people what they think, to avoid that he said, she said. In fact, Amit, you're at the University of Oklahoma, is that right? Well, I believe there used to be, in your journalism department, there was a gentleman by the name of Peter Gage, who was my teacher at University of Missouri, Columbia. And one of the things he said to us was, you must get all sides, all versions of the truth. There is no such thing as the absolute truth. And that applies in it's sort of a scientific technique. Yes, you use data to back up everything you say. Yes, you talk to people. Yes, you look for solutions, but you also provide the perspective, the nuances, etc., of bringing the issue to light. And I think when we go into our own personal experience and we're moved by certain things, that's what causes you to, and causes you to be true and passionate and sincere in your writing, and trying to convey, the enormity of what faces us, right? I mean, we're dealing with flooding, we're dealing with water pollution, which Kanika brought up and Avinash also brought up, and you have to think about it. Okay, if there's pollution happening, or if there's little water and there's pollution, so whatever wildlife, whatever fish or other species that exist are going to die. And that means your population, the people living on that particular fish or whatever sustenance, crabs, what have you, their source of revenue is gone, so they suffer, and they, so I mean, it comes down to economics. Everything is sort of interrelated. And then from a totally perspective of, I feel like my training in the sciences has actually helped me, allowed me to question and be able to also look for solutions, like I said at the start of the conversation, and also highlight the problems of deforestation that Kanika has been talking about extensively, the problems of economic opportunities that Avinash has been talking about. So.
I'd invite both Pankaj and Avinash to respond. And Pankaj, I also have one slightly related but slightly different question as well, especially dealing with aesthetics. Because since you've written both a novel and you've written a lot of books on the Andamans as well, what's the difference that you find in the representational register, if one were to put it, between fiction, writing fiction, for instance, and writing the other works, which you're kind of, you're quite prolific in terms of your writing on the Andamans, so to speak. So if you could respond to that, and maybe we can kind of close with Avinash as a response to this question as well. Because again, you have written a book as well, which I think might be interesting just in terms of the principles of construction of that book, the ability to speak in a certain sense, which is given by a particular medium as well.
Sure. So actually, I have written only one novel, so it's not like I've done a lot of writing. But I think the thing that strikes me about writing a novel, and that remains the possibility of a novel, is the complexity and the grace that we inhabit and the world is part of. Because I think as a journalist, certainly as a campaigner, even in the courts of law, the world is pretty much black and white. So the space for the gray, the space for the nuances, the space um, for the non-binary is actually not there, or is very limited. And I think what I realized in the novel is that it demands, and I think a good novel demands that you represent. In that sense, you also asked about representation, that all voices are symmetrical. I mean, in some senses, we if we are honest and we realize each one of us has our compromises and our compulsions, and there's no real good and bad. And I think what one of the lessons, if I might argue, from doing the novel, some very interesting, one or two very interesting, say, real life incidents of a real life person in the islands who knows me, disagrees with my position as an activist. But when he reads the novel, he agrees with the perspective of the novelist. And so there's a contradiction there. So he's seen the same person writing. And when I had a conversation with him through somebody else, he said, as an activist, he did not represent our voice. But as a novelist, I see myself in the story. So, what was the person that perhaps was unrepresented or misrepresented, or even perhaps the villain in real life? So there is that little bit of the gray area kind of expands, and that allows for a very interesting opening up. So you actually break down the silos. That's one very important thing that uh, fiction allows us to kind of do. Uh, on the other hand, I do feel that sometimes the other kind of writing is more effective. A short, quick piece, and that is a journalistic piece, reaches out much more quickly. It has a position. So it kind of goes both ways, and sometimes I feel one should be doing this, and sometimes I feel one should be doing that. But I think the question of storytelling, and I just wanted to make one point. I think good storytelling, along with good science, anything, what I might say, it might be the obvious, but I think it's so important. I have memories of what do we hold within us as memory. Uh, Good films and good stories and good books, and I think that does make a difference. So how do we kind of marry the two, for want of a better analogy, might be where the possibilities lie.
If I may just say one thing, I think it is very important for us to understand that while we are talking about climate change and indigenous communities, we have to bring in aesthetics in the sense that we have to at least recognize the aesthetics of the indigenous, which we don't. And our overall urban aesthetics remains highly colonial. So aesthetics is one of the most powerful tool of coloniality, and I think I've written this somewhere in some research papers in my book also. Through aesthetics we are able to control the mind of the larger section of the people without them realizing it. So for example, today, when even today, we extensively go for this American kitchens and security glass construction, low ceiling roof, air conditioning, we are somewhere, subscribing to a certain idea of luxury. And we are talking so much about climate change, indigenous communities, but then there is no recognition of the languages they speak, for example, and the aesthetics and the alternatives which actually are mainstream for them, but for us they are alternate lifestyle choices. So, just to give up, let's say, a shampoo, or just to give up plastic, which again, is brought in a certain way, let's not get there, but to at least acknowledge the existence of the indigenous language, aesthetics, and a certain kind of lifestyle, which is absolutely perfectly possible, is something that we all need to do. And I think that is what I have tried to address in my work. So I've not written a fiction, I've written a piece of nonfiction, but it delves on the story that I created in terms of a performance. And I've termed it the cursed land of lustful women. But I'm actually turning the game. So I'm actually connecting environment and gender. And I think there is a very strong connection from ancient times across the world of these two factors. So, again, I think it is extremely important for us to respect and acknowledge the existence and the aesthetics and the lifestyle, and the language, for example, and the culture of indigenous people across the world, because they are the ones who've lived with nature.
Thank you. And we give the last word, since we have upon the hour, to Avinash, and then I'll conclude with a vote of thanks.
Just I want to say that either bad or good, I don't know, but I'm not a researcher, I'm not a writer, and I'm a practitioner, I'm a campaigner. So my focus is always about telling stories which can move people. So if you see my book also about Singrauli files, I try to capture the people's story, which often gets invisible in our academics or in our discussions. So I try to make those people's story visible about their fight against fight against to protect their forest, fight against some power plants, thermal power plants, fight against pollution and so on. I would just like to mention also that we really need to also see the visuals of our stories. We need to create visuals, which is because when we say text and all, like we need to also create visuals because it makes more accessible, right? I would just give two recent examples where what we did. We talk a lot about loss and damage, climate finance, and so on, and often it goes with the big numbers. But what we did simply last year is we started doing a museum of memories where we collected the articles and things which got damaged during some climate change, like some climate events in cyclone or in flood or in heat wave. We reached out to across communities of the country and we collected those stories. And then when we presented those stories and we invited the policymakers, MPs, and some, like we also invited the fossil fuel companies to visit our museum. And when they saw those stories, and it was a very personal things, like we had a cycle which got damaged, we had a lot of like things which has a very like a personal stories. That was really very moving to for the audience. Then we also invited those communities who are at the forefront of it, and we created a human libraries. So we were not talking about from some books, but those individuals, those community members were sharing about their experiences, and that really moved a lot to the urban audience. And at the same time, we also need to we need to stop just saying like presenting the story of crisis and so on. We need to present the story of resilience, and there are a lot of resilient stories are there in the community. We need to talk about that as well. So somehow we need to also radically visualize the hopeful picture and make people radically visualize the hopeful future. Otherwise, yeah, we are not going to move people.
Yeah, Avinash, I attended one of those exhibitions, I think when that happened in Delhi at Triveni, and it was absolutely fabulous. It was absolutely impressive, and I'm so happy we had that conversation there. Thank you for that.
That was a very hopeful note to end our conversation as well. And since I'm a literary scholar, I'll do some shairi to end. Like I wish we had word enough and time to continue this conversation for all time, but since the hour is near, we'll probably have to stop it here, right? So thank you so much. This was an enriching experience, and of course, a conversation from which I learned a lot, and I'm sure that for the festival and people who are watching this video, this is going to be a conversation that's going to stoke a lot of questions. It's going to stoke a lot of conversations as well. And personally, of course, I'm so glad to be in touch with all of you to know about your work. This is something, I mean, Pankaj, of course, I've met earlier. We've spoken in a forum earlier, but it was great to meet you, Avinash, Amina, and Kanika. And then your works are something that I'll definitely be reading over the summer and learning from them.